Have you ever fallen asleep in the wrong place? Maybe church. Maybe work. I think Robert caught me sleeping in my office this week. I was really tired. Maybe school. Maybe you have fallen asleep as your spouse is telling you about their day. That's a dangerous one. Maybe you've fallen asleep while waiting for a plane at the airport and you missed your flight. That happened to a friend of mine. Or maybe you've fallen asleep while your wife is in labor with your second daughter. Actually, that's an understandable one. Let me explain what happened. Sarah went into labor toward the end of a very long day, and I simply suggested, quite innocently so, that we ought to just sleep it off a little bit and get some rest before the long day at the hospital. I admit, looking back, I was in the wrong on that one. I think I might have misread the situation. Of course, our story this morning is about a young man who falls asleep during a sermon. As you can imagine, this is a favorite passage for many pastors. You see what can happen when you fall asleep during a sermon, don't you? My favorite part of the story is that after Eutychus dies and is raised back to life, Paul doesn't stop preaching. He goes right back upstairs and finishes his sermon like a boss. I love it. But you have to give Paul and Eutychus a little grace here. First of all, Paul's only spending a short amount of time in Troas. He's intended, as the text says, to leave the next day. So he's trying to get through as much teaching as possible while he still has time with this community. And he's teaching at night because it's a Sunday. And for most folks, they would have worked all day, and the only time they were available to meet was at nighttime, including Eutychus. In fact, Eutychus, which is a name that means lucky, Eutychus is actually a name that was common for slaves in the first century. Remember, in the early church, most of the early church was made up of women and slaves. So it's likely that Eutychus had been working all day in a field, perhaps as a slave, back-breaking work, and now he's in church trying to listen to one of Paul's sermons through the night. But his biggest mistake, he sat in the window. Bad idea. And Eutychus sank off to a deep sleep before falling 3 stories dead. But when Paul gets to him, even though he's dead, Paul says, do not be alarmed, for his life is still in him. And then we have in this story one of the few resurrection accounts in the Bible. But I would suggest that the main theme of our text this morning is not the dangers of sleeping in church, as much as I would love to talk about that. This is a story about a miraculous healing, a resurrection, and how it happens in the context of worship and communion. But I also want us to think about how the Bible talks about sleep. Now, I'm not just talking about literal sleep. I'm talking about spiritual sleep. Because the Bible uses sleep as an image for spiritual apathy. Apathy is defined by a lack of interest, a lack of conviction, or a lack of passion. It's a spiritual sluggishness. It's when you disengage and stop caring. It's when the early church fathers would call spiritual sloth, which became one of the 7 deadly sins in the 4th century. It's been said that the greatest enemy to holiness is apathy. And this is what the Bible means when it refers to sleepy Christians. In Revelation 3, Jesus says, I know your works. You have a name for being alive, but you are dead. Wake up and strengthen what remains. In Romans 13, the Apostle Paul says, you know what time it is, how it is now the moment for you to wake from sleep, for salvation is nearer to us now than when we became believers. Paul says in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, we should not be sleeping, but we should be awake and have self-control. The Bible isn't talking about literal sleep. It's talking about a spiritual indifference toward life. Sleepy Christians are the ones who are disengaging in their relationship with God. And I think it's possible that Paul had this experience in his mind, this experience with Eutychus when he wrote these words in Ephesians chapter 5, "Wake up, sleeper, and rise from the dead, and Christ will shine on you." Waking up a sleepy Christian is a way of talking about spiritual revival. If you think about these terms historically, the most significant revivals in North American history occurred in the early 1700s. This is during a time when people actually had disengaged from Christianity, stopped going to church, and there was great violence and brawling and drunkenness. But George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards started their preaching ministry. And thousands upon thousands of people would flock to these open fields to hear the gospel. In this moment in history, the greatest American revival is known as the Great Awakening. One biographer, in his biography about George Whitefield, subtitled it, "The Voice That Woke the World." Waking up sleepy Christians is a picture for spiritual revival. But what about you? How are you doing with this? When you think about your own faith right now, would you characterize your relationship with God as being sleepy or awake? Do you feel alive in your faith, or do you feel sluggish? Do you sense the overwhelming presence of God in your life? Are you ready? Are you alert to move and act whenever God might call you to do something? Whenever God might call you to speak to somebody? Or are you too sleepy to notice what God is doing around you? In Matthew 26, right before his betrayal, Jesus is praying with his disciples in the Garden of Gethsemane. And every time he would come back to check on his disciples, he would find them sleeping. And he says, "Stay awake and pray that you do not fall into the trial of temptation." And if we step back and we think about our culture today, if we analyze what it means to be in this American society, how would you describe most Americans spiritually? Would you say that they are awake or sleeping? I think we can confidently say that there is great indifference and apathy in American culture right now. Sure, some people might be willing to post something on social media. Maybe they're willing to make a video on TikTok, but what are they actually doing about it? Journalist and managing editor of Time magazine, Lily Rothman, said this in 2012, "It's harder than ever to care about anything anymore." And then she called the time we're living in as the great whatever. The spiritual revival of the 1700s was called the Great Awakening, but we are living in the great whatever. There's a reason why sociologists call this moment in time in which we're living in as the age of apathy. If you pay attention, you're going to see spiritual sleepiness all around. There's a growing sense of despair in our world. Young people today feel increasingly anxious and hopeless about the future. They feel hopeless about the state of our planet. They feel depressed about their ability to one day buy a home or one day get married or one day have a good job. They feel worried, afraid, anxious, depressed, and as a result, many folks are checking out emotionally. They're disengaging altogether. They're numbing out with drugs or alcohol. They medicate themselves with as much medications as possible so that they can feel as little as possible through life. They spend their evenings and weekends watching Netflix, playing video games, or scrolling on their phone. You ever go to a waiting room these days or ride the bus? What do you notice that people are doing? Do they look up? Do they speak to one another? Or are they scrolling on their phones? Do you ever just laugh and you're like, we look like sleepy zombies? What happened to us? It's the age of apathy. The average baby boomer spends 4 hours and 20 minutes on their phone a day. Gen Xers spend 4 hours and 50 minutes on their phone a day. Millennials, 5.5 hours. Gen Zers, 6.5 hours. By the time you die, you will have spent at least 12 years of your life looking at your phone. So I'll ask you again, are we going through life awake or sleepy? I heard one theologian say that spiritual apathy is refusing the God-given means to make our lives interesting. We're spending our time watching other people live their life online than live it ourselves. So how is it with your soul? How would you characterize your relationship with God these days? Are you awake? Of course, this growing sense of spiritual indifference is nothing new. In the wake of the Second World War, many people around the world, especially in Central and Western Europe, questioned the meaning of life. And this gave birth to the philosophical movement known as French existentialism, which suggested that life is absurd, it is inherently meaningless. Its close philosophical cousin is nihilism. But the quintessential novel representing this movement was the book called The Stranger by Albert Camus. Did you ever read this book? So depressing. The story centers around a character named Meursault who is insufferably indifferent to the world around him. He feels nothing, even after committing a murder. The famous first lines to the book are these words: "Mother died today, or was it yesterday?" It's been said that the opposite of love is not hate, it's indifference. It's not caring anymore. In 1964, a woman named Kitty Genovese was assaulted and stabbed right outside her own apartment building. And even though she screamed at the top of her lungs, "Oh my God, I've been stabbed, help me," nobody came to help her. It was later reported that 37 witnesses either saw the murder or heard the screams, but nobody intervened. Nobody called the police. She was found hours later. Psychologists would later go on and study this event and come up with the term the bystander effect. Have you heard of this? It's when people freeze up when tragedy strikes because they don't know what to do, or they think somebody else is going to do something about it, or they just don't care. That happened in 1964. Could it happen today? Honestly, I think the biggest difference when this happens today is that people do pull out their cell phones, but not to call the police, but to record it and then post it online. Last year I was driving through Marysville and I saw a vicious fight between teenagers, kids who were carrying baseball bats, and they were surrounded by a group of people who were not intervening, who were not helping, but they were recording it on their phones. We are approaching new levels of indifference and apathy and a general lack of empathy. I'm going to ask again, do you think people are asleep right now? But what about the church? What about us? John Stott once said, "We should not ask what's wrong with the world. That's all too easy. We know the answer there. We need to ask what has happened to the salt and the light." What's happened to the church? How do you wake up sleepy, Christians? That's the question we're asking today. Jesus told a parable about this in Matthew 25. He said there was once 10 bridesmaids waiting for a wedding celebration, and each bridesmaid had a lamp. In this particular culture, you'd have a wedding celebration at night, and the bridesmaids would have an oil lamp, and they would be a part of a lighted up processional toward the wedding celebration. And Jesus said 5 of the bridesmaids were wise, and 5 of the bridesmaids were foolish. The wise bridesmaids brought oil for their lamps, but the foolish bridesmaids did not. And while they were waiting for the groom, they all fell asleep. But at midnight, there was a great shout, "Look, the groom is coming! Come out to meet him!" But the foolish bridesmaids said to the wise, "Give us some of your oil, for our lamps are going out." But the wise bridesmaids said, "No, there's not enough. You had better go to the dealers quickly and buy some for yourselves." And while they went out to buy it, that's when the groom came. And those who were ready were the ones who went with him to the wedding banquet, and then the door was shut. And the foolish bridesmaids went up and they said, "Lord, Lord, open to us." But he replied, "Truly, I do not know who you are." And then Jesus said, "Stay awake, for you know neither the day nor the hour." Now, obviously, this is a parable about staying awake and being ready and being alert, because you never know when judgment's going to come. Either the second coming of Jesus or when your time runs out. You never know. Be ready, be alert, live your life like every day counts. But this parable is also about wisdom. And wisdom is about understanding and seeing the truth. The wise bridesmaids were the ones who understood. They understood what their responsibility was. We got to have oil. We got to be ready. How do you wake up sleepy Christians? I could stand up here and talk to you all about you need to read your Bibles. You need to go to church. You need to pray more. You need to listen to worship music. You need to do acts of service. And yes, all of those things are absolutely essential to maintaining your relationship with Christ. But the wise are the ones who understand it in their heart and in their head. Cognitively, they get it. Their eyes are open and they see the overwhelming love of God. The Bible often compares our relationship with God to a marriage. We are the bride. Jesus is the groom. And the strongest marriages are the ones where each spouse recognizes and understands and cherishes in their head and in their heart the gift that is their spouse. They don't take that person for granted. It's those moments when you become increasingly aware of just how blessed you are to be with that person. But of course, marriages can grow cold. Spouses can get sleepy. I asked my wife, Sarah, who is a marriage and family therapist, about this. And I asked her, when she's doing marital counseling with a couple, how do you help wake up a sleepy marriage? She said, well, it's complicated, but one of the things that many therapists will do early on is they're going to ask a struggling couple, how did you first meet? What first attracted you to that person? What stirred inside you that love at the beginning? And she said, when you watch a couple talking about how they first fell in love, you're going to learn a lot. And if they light up as they're talking about that first initial love in their marriage, you can see there's life, there's hope, there's something still there, there's the spark of love. It's an awareness. It's coming to understand. In Revelation 2, Jesus told the church in Ephesus, you have forgotten your first love. Remember, from which you have fallen, repent and do the works that you did at first. Remember that first love. Of course, I think of movies, even romantic comedies, friends. Sleepless in Seattle, When Harry Met Sally, or the movie You've Got Mail. I like that one. At the very end, when Meg Ryan is waiting for her secret admirer in the park, she's also got this complicated relationship going on with Tom Hanks' character. They started off as enemies, but then they became friends. And over time, they started to fall in love. But Meg Ryan, as she's got this complicated relationship with Tom Hanks, she's talking to this anonymous guy on email. And it's complicated because she's starting to develop feelings for both of them, and she doesn't realize they're the same guy. And when Tom Hanks shows up at the park, she realizes it's him. She says, "I wanted it to be you." But you see the moment of realization on her face when she sees that it's him. It's an awakening. It's an understanding. It's comprehension. She gets it. That's how you wake up sleepy Christians, by helping them understand, to know and love the character of God. This is the prayer that Paul prayed for Christians in Ephesians 3. I pray that you may have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. It's a love story. Like a spouse realizing after 15 years of marriage, I'm the luckiest guy in the world because she picked me. And you know how I know that? Because when she was in labor and I fell asleep, she didn't kill me. That is grace, brothers and sisters. And in our faith, it's those moments that you realize with all wisdom and understanding, amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved a wretch like me. It's the moment when the prodigal son returns to his father. And instead of being turned away, he's embraced by his father with a hug and a kiss. It's the moment when the adulterous woman, instead of being shamed, Jesus tells her, I do not condemn you. Go and sin no more. It's the moment when Peter, after denying Christ, instead of being dismissed and sent away, he's reinstated, and Jesus tells him, go and feed my sheep. Life is full of a million moments where you become more aware of God's love for you. That is wisdom. But you have to stop and open your eyes. You have to get it here, and you got to get it here. Do you recognize the immense glory of God's grace for you? That you are far more wretched than you understand. That He is far more loving than you could possibly comprehend. But He says to us, do not revel in your wretchedness. And as Paul prays, that we would come to have the power to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, to know the love of Christ that surpasses knowledge. Let us pray.